Oh, I always know when that comes on, that means we're right at the noon hour, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to our Time to Act Mental Health Echo. If you will take a minute and put your name and contact information into the chat, that just helps us all know who's on the call. If you feel comfortable turning on your cameras, that would be great as well. As you noticed, we are recording today's session. You are always able to go back and review the sessions. It's stored on our Canvas page as well as our YouTube channels. So it's sometimes hard to digest everything in this first little bit. So going back and watching them or sharing them with colleagues is a great way to do that. And that is why we record them. Echo is an interactive community, so please put your contact information and your questions into chat. Kurt Phillips or one of the other amazing hub members that have an asterisk or will now have an asterisk in front of their name would be glad to make sure your questions get answered. It's a great way to just continue to build this community, even though we're virtual. If we were in person, we'd all be chit-chatting. So have those conversations over Zoom. Again, another way to get information is a case narrative. Those are a great way to listen to what other people on this call are. So I called on Kurt. He's the one I can see on my screen right this minute. He always has some really useful information from a physical therapy standpoint. And so when I have families that I'm working with that are struggling with different things, he's a great resource to do that. So knowing who's on that call. We do talk about sensitive topics and utilizing those cases that we work with or those families we work with. Please remember to avoid using any identifiable information. Again, if you have any questions, reach out to a hub member if you're unsure. This is our new network for our Time to Act mental health. I hope you guys joined us last year. If not, this year we have a great wealth of speakers that are going to be joining us. Key components of an echo session always have a didactic speaker, a case presentation where all of you guys then share your resources and recommendations for the case that was presented. It is a way to build that professional networking. So I know that when I have a question about trauma with a client that I'm working with, I can reach out to Vonda and say, what is the best way to do this? Or reach out to Stephanie and say, Stephanie, I need some help. What are some resources I can provide this family? So it's really that great way of knowing other people throughout the state who we can reach out to. If you will take a minute and rename your profile, let us know where you're from so that I know that Stephanie Anderson really runs that Help Me Grow and know that Help Me Grow has some great resources. You can raise your hand or just put your contact information, rename your profile, or ask your questions in chat. And like I said, Kurt Phillips will make sure those questions are monitored. Registration, you can always reach out to Time to Act at aggies.usu.edu, and we will be sure to answer all those questions. In order to get a credit of attendance, we do ask that you fill out the survey. Shayna will be dropping the survey in chat throughout today's session, and that is how we keep these series and sessions free. So thank you to everybody who always fills those out. It provides us useful information. Canvas is where we store everything. If you want access to our Canvas page, please just email us at timetoact@aggies.usu.edu with Canvas registration request in the subject line, and we will make sure you have access to that. again, a great way to get information and resources from all these amazing people on the call is to submit a case study. So if there's a family that you're struggling with, or you just want more information about how to work with them, please consider doing a case study. Sometimes they are scary to present. If that is one of your holdups, please reach out to me. I would be more than happy to share your case, and so that you guys get those resources. Last year in our network, we gave over 800 resources out to you guys as participants. And so it's just a great way to learn from each other. We do have a social media, so if you want to take a minute and follow us on social media, we share resources and information that is shared along to us, as well as information about future topics. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I am going to stop sharing if I can find the stop share button, and turn the time over to Vonda, who is our amazing presenter today.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that introduction, Janelle. And I think that the whole ecosystem is really amazing. And I just appreciate being able to be here with you today. So I'm going to be talking, of course, about trauma-informed care for babies, toddlers, young kids, and also for parents as well, because we don't want to forget them. And just to give you a quick overview of what we'll talk about, we'll just do a really basic discussion of trauma, and we'll talk a little bit about the impact of trauma on babies and toddlers. And I'd love for us to have, a similar understanding of what trauma-informed care is, and talk about strategies to support babies, toddlers, and young kids, and then also to think about strategies to support parents and caregivers as well. And, for people working with young kids who have experienced trauma, they can be really hard at times to kind of manage and to deal with, just for our own emotions. And so I want us to take a moment to think about that potential impact on childcare providers, and think about, in the moment, what can a person do to kind of recenter themselves so that they can be available and present for a young kid. And then, we'll talk about some practical approaches to implementing trauma-informed care in our everyday interactions with kids. And with that, to begin and to kind of focus our attention, I'd like to watch this short clip from Sesame Street that is somewhat triggering, I have to tell you. And so if you're a person who's had a really difficult experience with domestic violence, or who gets triggered easily when you see difficult situations, just know that you're welcome to turn your camera off, turn the volume off, whatever it is that you might need to do. The other thing is to know that this is it's just a scenario of what could happen. Nobody was really harmed in this video. If that can help you, watch that a little bit easier. Let's see.
Here, Grandpa's here. Okay, okay, shh, shh, shh. I'm here now. Grandpa's here. I know you're scared. You're safe now. Out came the sun and dried up all the rain. Now the eensy weensy spider climbed up the spout again.
So as we think about this video, which is sadly a real life experience for many children in our country and around the world, I'd like us to think about the caregiving environment, first of all, for these two young, beautiful children. And the first thing that I notice is that lack of access to a responsive adult who could buffer the experience of those scary sounds. And this often happens when there's trauma. And it's the very first thing that babies and young children need to feel safe, to be protected. And yet when an adult is in the midst of their own trauma, based on what's happening in their brain, it can be really hard to be emotionally available to a young child. And we see that the response of the kids is crying. And at first, this little one, she comforts the baby. But then when she hears that slap, it overwhelms her ability to care for the baby. And I might notice that she has this strength in being able to be there for this baby at all. That says that maybe there's been some really good caregiving in the past for this little one. We notice that the baby cries and, they might begin to crawl, but then like they just become kind of stuck. And, the little girl, she picks up a comfort object and she goes to the closet and kind of tries to self-comfort there. And what helps get them through it is that their grandpa comes and he helps to make them know that they are safe. And we always want to remember this, that a caring adult has the power to change the story. And that's where all of us come in. So, it's critical to think about what is trauma. And, the American Psychological Association, I thought had this really succinct definition, which I just made a little bit more succinct. It's this emotional response to a terrible event or multiple terrible events. It's, what happens to us? Well, how do we deal with something that happens? A trauma typically threatens our feelings of safety, security, well-being, and the person, it doesn't matter if it's a baby, a toddler, a young child, a teenager, a parent, a child care provider. When we experience trauma, we're typically impacted deeply by this experience. And as we focus in a little bit more on babies and young children, we know that trauma can happen once, or it might happen multiple times. It might be something that is a normal part of that child's environment. And that number and type of traumatic events, is it really important? We know that reactions can vary by age and the child's temperament. We can see a differential impact in kids who experience similar trauma. We do tend to see some gender differences as kids grow and develop as well. Sometimes we don't see the impact of early trauma until adolescence or later. And then, cultural norms can, of course, impact the family response and begin to color that child's response to trauma as well. And, as I'm thinking about trauma for babies and young kids, some of those examples might be, domestic violence, physical abuse, physical neglect, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, the loss of a parent, separation through hospitalization or painful medical procedures that babies have to go through. But still, that is a loss for them, that separation. Parental substance abuse is another one. There are other things like, car accident, a natural disaster, violence in the neighborhood. Those can also be impactful for a baby or child, but typically less than that interpersonal or relational trauma, and especially that trauma that occurs with their primary caregivers. A parent with depression or some type of mental health issues or mental illness can also be difficult for a little one because they depend so heavily on their caregivers for their own emotional needs. And if there's another person there who's able to buffer the impact of that primary caregiver not being emotionally available to a child, then that little one will typically do much better. When they don't have buffers available, Edtronic found that babies who experienced postnatal or, postpartum depression from their primary caregiver, their mother typically, without a buffer, they were 2 to 3 times more likely to experience mental health challenges in their adolescence, which is typically when we see, mental health challenges express themselves more and more. And, I'm sure that you've seen great examples of what trauma is in the children that you've interacted with in your own personal lives. And of course, babies are greatly impacted, but they just don't have the words to express themselves, to say what's happening. So this is a big list with lots of different potential impacts of trauma. This is the thing that we need to always remember. Just because a baby or young child has experienced trauma doesn't mean that they're going to experience all of these impacts. We may not really see much in the baby. That's not really common, but sometimes we don't notice as much. We might notice that they begin to withdraw more. And so many people, when they see a baby who's just really quiet, they just say, "Oh, what a good baby." And it might be that that baby's really calm and just is easily entertained just by the normal sounds in the environment. And it might also mean that this baby has experienced something else and they're just kind of going into themselves. So, like, I always try to think about good baby a little bit differently, or, help people think a little bit more about good babies, that, oh, let's think about what that baby's temperament is. And have we seen any changes in their behavior that would maybe make us a little bit more concerned? And are all of these behavioral impacts important? It's important because we need to, first of all, remember that babies are born wired for social interactions and attachment. they expect social interaction with somebody else. And when they don't get it, that's when they begin to have a little bit of a challenge. I've done a bit of work in different orphanages in Ecuador, India, Haiti, and Russia. And what I've seen there is the toll of not having a responsive caregiver for babies. You know, when I was going through college and my master's degree and getting my PhD, I always learned that, you know, babies under the age of 6 months, they all coo and babble. Well, I can tell you that babies who experience severe neglect do not coo and babble. They might, but many of them do not. And that is part of that becoming withdrawn and kind of sinking into themselves. They depend entirely on their caregivers for safety and emotional needs. And when those needs are not met, babies experience a lot of stress. And sometimes we see it through just lots and lots of crying. And I was amazed at how many babies also just sort of shut down. So something for us to think about. And as we think about the impact of ongoing trauma and, you know, in the infancy, toddler, and early childhood period, you know, what happens is that changes the structure and the wiring of the brain. When a baby experiences stress, what happens is their amygdala, or their fear center of their brain, gets activated. And that's great because that's there to protect the baby, you know, and that helps them get through this momentary crisis. But the amygdala is only supposed to be there in these occasional things that happen, and it just takes over our brains for us. For a baby who experiences a lot of trauma, what happens is the amygdala becomes the go-to center of the brain, and that colors everything for a baby. You know, it sensitizes the baby to future trauma, and they begin to expect trauma. The amygdala becomes activated very easily so that when somebody comes to interact with the baby, rather than being curious or expecting some type of fun, positive interaction, this baby's brain has learned that this signifies danger, and you might be there with a wonderful purpose, but that baby may kind of shy back from you. It can result in externalizing behaviors of children. You know, we think of those as misbehaviors, but really it's that baby's ability, or young child's ability, to cope with what they're experiencing. And it's amazing to see the adaptations that the brain makes that might make it difficult for us to deal with some of these behaviors. And what we can do is, through our own knowledge, support what we see happening in the brain to get that child through this difficult situation. You know, with ongoing trauma that can impact their learning, their ability to focus, to plan, to trust other people. It can impact their ability to develop their self-regulation skills. And, you know, because these first 3 years in particular are the fastest time of development in a baby's life, their brains will never be as quickly developing as they are in the first 3 years of life. You know what? Just in a general way, often babies who have experienced trauma become needier. And, you know, that's often just at the time that their caregivers may be less available emotionally. So that can create a difficult cycle. And for babies in substitute care, this is where the caregiver, the child care provider, can be such a godsend to this baby or toddler or young child. So many people talk about how, well, you know, this happened when they're really, really young. They'll never remember. We have to think about what's happening in the brain and how sensory young children are, especially babies in particular, but through the first 3 years of life. Babies' sensory experiences are so powerful. And so as we think about what babies see, hear, smell, taste, and feel, those experiences develop implicit memories. You know, they're coded deep in our sensory experiences in our brains. And those experiences can impact us throughout our entire lives. So we really do have to do away with this thought that they're too young to remember, they're too young to understand. It is true that they may not understand what's happening, but their body is getting some understanding about this world and their safety in it that can be problematic down the road. So again, you know, they don't necessarily have that capacity to understand. They don't have words for what's happened. And they have few coping skills, you know, like we saw in the video, that little girl, she did have some coping skills. And then her ability to cope became overwhelmed. You know, and as we think about maybe if we think about the childcare environment for just a minute, having these different social interactions all day long can be exhausting for a child. And for a child who's experienced trauma, then their limit, their breaking point can come a lot earlier than for a child who has not experienced trauma. So we might see kids who melt down, who have a really hard time being present, and there are things that we can do to support them. You know, when a young child has experienced trauma once, they're more likely to experience it again. And then as we think about, if we think about the child welfare system, I don't know if you already know that the age group that is most likely to be seen in child welfare are those babies 0 to 1 year of age. And then the next most likely are the babies from 1 to 2, and then from 2 to 3. So you've got a really vulnerable population, and you have a time in their brain when those early experiences have an influence throughout their lives. So I just like us to keep that in our minds. You know, lots of times when there is trauma that's happening with a child, there's a lack of predictability of when that might happen. And, you know, for babies and toddlers, one way that they really develop is through predictability. And when I was in the different orphanages that I've worked in, the orphanages where there was more predictability for the babies and young kids, those kids did so much better. And that I learned early on that predictability is key for young kids. And so any way that we can increase predictability for kids, that can be really powerful for them. It's important to know that kids in poverty are more likely to experience trauma than other other kids are. And then I want to also think about what predicts recovery from trauma. A sensitive, caring adult. That's all that a child needs. And it's the very best if the child's parents were available, but that's not always possible. And when they're not, secondary providers can be so helpful. So, I just want to remind us that there's no such thing as a baby. There's always a baby and someone. If you were walking down the street and you saw a baby or a 2-year-old outside and there was no adult around and nobody came after 10 minutes to be checking on a child, you would be really concerned probably about what is happening. And, that's just something in our world. Babies depend on us. And the reality is that babies and toddlers can't wait because their development is happening right now and their needs continue even when a crisis happens. So their coping is greatly affected by their caregivers' reactions, and that includes their childcare providers or the other people who are in their lives. Again, those consistent and predictable routines help stabilize a child whose world might be falling apart. And, your work is critical, especially for the parents who are there to support their kids. As a former child welfare worker, I can say with a lot of confidence that 98% of the parents, maybe even 99% of the parents that I worked with who were in the child welfare system loved their kids more than anything in this world, and they did not want to hurt them, but they didn't always know what to do. These two pictures to me kind of illustrate that saying that there's no such thing as a baby. There's a baby and someone else. These are two babies who experienced Hurricane Katrina. And we can see the little one, the little toddler on the left, who is so upset. We look at that little one's caregiver, and I can just imagine how overwhelmed that person is as well. And this might just be a momentary thing, but you notice the lack of physical contact. You notice that child is just alone, just like the little ones in the video that we saw. And what happens for that child? They've just experienced something extremely stressful. And if we look at the baby on the right, what we notice is that when there are really stressful events, when we have the comfort and the buffering of that experience by a caring adult, particularly a caregiver or a parent, how babies and children can thrive no matter what curveball they've been thrown in life. So as we shift to thinking about trauma-informed care, there are 4 elements of trauma-informed care. Realizing that impact of trauma and thinking that there are many potential paths for recovery and having somebody there for adults and for children. Having somebody who's their rock is so important. Part of trauma-informed care is being able to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. And, to not assume, because some of those signs we saw are just normal developmental things that happen also. But when we begin to get a number of signs together and we begin to maybe hear more about the story, then we can pick out those signs a little bit easier. And then we respond by integrating the knowledge that we have about trauma into not only the policies where we work, but the practices, how we interact with parents, caregivers, individuals, families, how we interact with staff members. And the last one is how we actively resist re-traumatizing a person who has experienced trauma. We need to think about and learn what triggers this person and how can I make sure to help them feel safe. When we do these 4 things, we're creating safety for all of the above: the childcare providers, the mental health clinicians working with us, the behavioral health workforce, babies, children, parents, all of us. So, we want to understand what's happening with the child, get their story, and we want to try to learn strategies so that we can maintain our own regulation in the face of really sometimes incredibly difficult behaviors that we see in individuals who have experienced trauma. Do you know, I just read about this trauma attuned care. And since we're talking about babies and young kids, and attunement is so important, I wanted to just acknowledge this, that being trauma attuned means that you develop a sensitivity and an awareness that enables you to be responsive in the moment to what somebody else is experiencing. So you might be having all sorts of feelings yourself, and yet you are able to keep yourself pulled together, attuned to what's happening for them, and respond. These are the things that are critical, right? In particular for babies, because they are beginning to, or they're on their pathway of developing attachment. And that attunement to their needs and responsiveness can be so important. So let's think about general trauma-informed strategies for working with babies, toddlers, young kids. First of all, we want to create a safe environment. We want to establish some consistent routines, clear boundaries about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. As we think about toddlers, for babies, we hopefully are being responsive to their needs. And sometimes people think that being trauma informed means that we don't have high expectations of young kids. When I think about these clear boundaries, and that's not at all true. We still have high expectations, and how we support kids in rising to those expectations might change just a little bit. So something else we do to create a safe environment is to have a safe space, a physically safe space that has comforting elements like soft toys, calming colors. You might have music sometimes. You as a caregiver, if you were a caregiver, would be physically available to a child to help them feel safe. As we think about supporting their emotional regulation, first of all, we can validate children's emotions by acknowledging their feelings, providing comfort and reassurance. And we can do this for babies as well. We can talk to them as they are really struggling and say, "Oh, I know it's so hard. I'm so sorry that you're having a hard time. I'm here," as you're there to help help them get more physiologically regulated again. Because I'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, physiological regulation is the first precursor to emotional regulation. So as we think about that physiological regulation, what's happening within a baby or toddler's or young child's body, and how we can support their regulation. We want to use language that reflects empathy and understanding, like, oh, I can see you're really upset. It's okay to feel that way. What we can't do is hurt your friend. Let's think of another way to handle this. What could you do? And sometimes kids can't do that in the moment. And so we might have to distract them, take them to a different area, help to get them back regulated again. Let me say here that timeouts, particularly for kids who have experienced trauma, are really not helpful because they've already had to try to figure out whatever's happened to them on their own quite often. And so when we put them in a timeout, what we are doing is we are re-traumatizing that child, and to expect them to be able to calm down on their own is really not possible. We might see kids begin to, like, maybe they're violent and they're just going crazy for a few minutes in this timeout, and then finally they're just exhausted and they've stopped. It's not that, we've won and we've shown them that they need to be calm, but it's that their body just kind of shut down. And so when we have kids who have really difficult emotions, us supporting that transfer back to regulation is critical. As we think about babies, we pick babies up when they cry because they don't have the ability to kind of soothe themselves yet. They begin to develop different strategies. They figure out their thumb, they suck on their thumb, they might suck on an object. Those are self-soothing strategies. Sometimes when they hear their caregiver's voice when they start to cry, especially for a child who's been picked up when they cry and kind of helped to calm down, then when they hear the caregiver's voice, if the caregiver can't come right now, they begin to calm down. Sometimes the caregiver begins to sing. It's just important to know that they need us to support their emotional regulation. We're a co-regulating species. So if somebody comes up to you in the parking lot and kind of starts going off on you, it's probably likely that you might get offended a little bit easily and be like, whoa, what on earth are you doing? I didn't deserve any of that. You need to back off now. And what's really critical in those moments is helping to bring somebody down. If somebody walks up to you and starts doing that, and you say, whoa, I can see you're really upset. What's happening here? How can I help? Tell me more. I want to hear. And your calm, just your calm presence helps to calm that person down. It might take time if they're really amped up. And of course, we always think about our own safety and keeping children safe. Sometimes we might have to help a child stay safe. And one strategy that I've really liked a lot, because it's one of the fastest that we can do, is breathing. I don't know if you guys have seen the Sesame Street breathing video. If you have not, you've got to Google it. It is fabulous. It helps to teach kids how to do the belly breathing and to learn that they can control their responses to difficult situations. It's really hard to think that, right? Those of us who are a little bit older and have more wisdom now, I look back to when I was younger and a new parent and was overwhelmed sometimes, and how hard parenting is. Like, I get overwhelmed now as a grandparent sometimes because, kids they can really, I don't know, they can really impact us in so many ways. And we have to be the ones who use our coping strategies to then teach others simple coping strategies. A comfort object is another great idea for coping strategies. And again, us staying calm and composed, especially in those challenging situations, to help kids learn how to manage their own emotions. And, if you struggle with this, and even if you don't, like, I find that it's really good for me to practice before I'm going into situations. I care for my two young grandkids, my two young grandsons, 2 days a week. And I always think to myself before I go down there, how am I emotionally? What do I need to do to take care of me? And what am I going to do when the difficult times happen? Because, my oldest grandson, Jackson, is 8 now. Does he have his emotions figured out? No. Do any of you have your emotions figured out? I would dare to say not 100% of the time. Or maybe, yes, you have, but there might be some event that happens that kind of takes you way out of your comfort zone and you're not really sure how to respond. So I do a lot of talking to myself about, all right, how do I make sure that I'm emotionally available and present so that I can support my grandson's development of their emotional regulation? And, they're a big test, right? Like when I take them into a grocery store, I don't know why kids think when you go into a grocery store, they have your permission to just go nuts. But that's exactly what happens with my grandson sometimes. So, I'm a slow learner, but now what I do is before we go into the grocery store, I make sure that they're fed, that they've gotten some of their needs out, their physical needs to go run and play. And then we talk about it before we go in so that they get a reminder about what we expect. All right. A really key thing that we want to do, another trauma-informed strategy for supporting young ones is, we are building secure attachments with kids in our interactions with them. When we respond sensitively to that child's needs, cues, and this is especially important for babies who are developing those attachment relationships. And, for substitute caregivers, of course, they're developing an attachment to you as well. And, another way that we are supporting secure attachment is engaging in those positive, responsive interactions to build trust. And even for babies and toddlers who have experienced really difficult situations, our availability, our ability to be emotionally responsive and to respond to their needs, their individual needs, their cues, that makes a difference for that child. No matter what's happening for them at home, you are building a secure attachment with them. Predictable routines, again, of course, we cannot talk about predictable routines enough. Anybody who's worked with kids, like if you go on a field trip and then you come back and you're going to go home and the kids are like, whoa, wait, when are we going to do circle time? And what about our playtime? They have learned their predictable routine. And when that gets out of whack, they're a little bit like, whoa, what's happening here? And, you know, it's kind of funny to see that happen, but it's also a way that we really do recognize how important routines are for kids. It kind of gives them control over their environment. It helps them to master their environment and to feel safe. And of course, encouraging positive interactions. Whenever possible, I have praise here, but I really mean we want to use encouragement with kids. We don't want to just praise kids like good boy, good girl. We want to say, wow, you worked really hard on that. Tell me about it. We want to have positive reinforcement. When a child does something that we wanted them to do, hey, thanks so much for sharing with your friend. And when we focus on these positive things that kids do, then we are building their self-esteem. I'm one of the developers of the Piccolo model, and one of our really predictive behaviors is those positive interactions early in life for kids functioning in preschool and kindergarten, second grade, and fifth grade. So it's powerful how much these positive interactions make a difference for kids. Being able to provide physical comfort, whether that's holding, gently rocking, rubbing a child's back, if you are the primary caregiver, massage for a baby to help them feel safe, verbal reassurance to help kids feel secure as well. In early childhood, we have our saying, right? Catch them being good. This is really what we're doing. And the more that we notice what kids are doing that we want, the more likely we are, of course, to see those things. And, as we think about specific strategies for babies and toddlers, holding babies, I mentioned physiological regulation, that's their, their color, their heart rate, their breathing, their temperature, their digestion is part of physiological regulation. All of those things and even crying is part of their physiological regulation. And when we hold babies, we are supporting their physiological regulation. And then remember still that when we support their emotional regulation, we are supporting, or when we support their physiological regulation, we're supporting the development of their emotional regulation. Other things that we can do for babies and toddlers, singing, talking to them, pay attention to their signs of engagement. What is engagement in a baby? That's when they have those open, bright eyes, an alert face, they're smiling, they're turning or reaching towards you, they have calm breathing, the baby looks relaxed or the toddler looks relaxed. We see more smooth movements. And this is a great time for us to be interacting with them. We also want to pay attention to their signs of disengagement. And that might be when they begin to turn away, they grimace, frown, cry, have irregular breathing. They might start arching their backs if it gets pretty far along. Hiccuping can be a sign of disengagement. It can also just be hiccuping, right? Sneezing, yawning, becoming fussy, having a limp or a stiff posture. Both of those are signs of disengagement. Jerky movements, agitated movements. If their skin becomes blotchy or changes colors, their fingers might begin to splay like a basketball player trying to grip a basketball. And when your baby or even a toddler has several of these signs, if you would just see one or two, we might hold off and wait because they might be getting a little bit overwhelmed, but they might be able to pull it back together. But when we start to see several of these signs together, then we might stop the current activity, decrease the amount of stimulation, pick them up, and help them begin to recover. And that builds up their ability to take in more environmental input the next time. So we also want to observe your baby. We learn so much from watching babies. Anybody who has more than one child can probably attest to this, that you have your baby here and you it takes a while maybe, or maybe you just naturally know what they want, but you figure them out over time. And then you have a second baby and you might be thinking that these same things are going to be working, and nothing works. And so what we have to do is we really have to watch our baby and begin to understand what they're saying to us and respond. Sometimes there's a lot of like trial and error in those early weeks. And as we begin to figure it out, then we can better meet our baby's needs. Other strategies for supporting babies and toddlers and their development, as playing peekaboo, hiding objects. These are positive ways to engage them that when they're having a tough time, just might get their attention. And of course, sensory activities are so important for babies and toddlers because that sensory cortex in the brain is so stimulated. This is the area of the brain that is really just going crazy, making all sorts of connections in the brain in that first year in particular and onward. We want to avoid unnecessary separations for a baby who has experienced trauma. And we want to, of course, avoid trauma reminders and provide soothing activities. Now, as we think about specific strategies for toddlers through preschoolers, we think about having lots of outdoor play when possible. Play-Doh, doing things that really work their gross and their fine motor muscles. So outdoor play helps them get those big muscles moving, and that can get out some of that energy and stress from trauma. Finger painting is a great, all sorts of art activities are great activities that help a child, help support their recovery after trauma. Maybe tracing their body on a large paper and coloring it and letting them talk about themselves. Bubbles, with bubbles, babies or toddlers and preschoolers are learning more about how to control their breathing. I already mentioned that large muscle play. Water and sand play can be so important. Again, notice these are a lot of sensory experiences, because that sensory area of the brain is so important for recovery from trauma, especially for young kids. Massage, I mentioned before, especially if you are the primary caregiver. We don't always recommend massage for childcare providers necessarily. We really want to focus on the primary caregiver for that. And, this is something where you can be a real support to the parent by saying, have you ever thought about taking a class where you get to learn massage as a way of connecting and learning to communicate with your baby or toddler or preschooler? Music, dramatic play. We lots of times see kids really act out what they're experiencing through dramatic play. Puppets are another great way where kids get to kind of, show what they're experiencing. And us, we don't have to be experts to respond in dramatic play. We can just say, oh, you're mad, or you're really upset, and validate and normalize that child's experience. Making and reading books, when kids get to make books about themselves, we've worked a lot with different early childhood programs with bookmaking strategies, and invariably they always come back to say to us that the most used books on their shelves are the ones about the kids themselves. And then, if a child mentions trauma, being able to talk in simple terms about what's happening and give age appropriate information. Your grandma's sick. She's at the hospital, so doctors can help her to get better. Whenever, we see a lot of, not just the behaviors, but sometimes we hear through what kids are talking about, what they're experiencing. And, sometimes we're all mandated reporters. This ends up coming to a point where we need to report something. And, it can be really hard to do, but something that is trauma informed to do is to let parents know that we are going to need to report, and we want to be a support for them through this experience. We know that they want to keep their child safe, and we are mandated that we have to. And so we need to report now. All right. I'd love to have us think about Joseph for just a moment. Joseph has been biting other children. He will also swear if anybody upsets him. He's been known to yell at them so loud that the staff in the outer area can hear him. He's been in the classroom for 2 months. His family just moved to the area and just moved into a new apartment. His mom looks confused and at a loss when teachers talk about his behavior. He also has a new baby brother who is 3 months old. I'm noticing the time actually right now. And I have another case scenario. I think that I am going to not have us actually do this case scenario just because I noticed the time. And I'm going to move on for just a minute for more strategies for supporting parents and caregivers, and then, childcare providers or mental health, the mental health behavioral force working with families with kids who have experienced trauma. And then we'll get into a case scenario. So, a strategy to support parents and caregivers is, first of all, engaging and supporting families, keeping parents informed about what's happening in their child's day, what you've noticed around their behavior or development. And especially when we see the positive things, whatever positive things you can notice early on. Any of us, what do we want more than anything? We love it when people brag about our kids. We like it when people talk about what our kids are doing so well. And when you have to have these really difficult conversations about the observations that we've had with negative behavior, when we've got all these things that we've noticed about the positive behavior, it's like we've got money in the bank. We parents are more likely to be there for us because they know that we care about their kids. We've seen all these great things that they're doing, and we're telling them about it. Having opportunities to regularly meet with parents. So whether that is in the morning when parents are dropping their kids off, in the afternoon when they're taking their kids home, to have, times within the center where you just have parents come together. Being connected with parents is really helpful because you're all on the same team. You all want this child to thrive. Every one of you, even a parent who is traumatizing their child wants their child to thrive. They just may not know how to do it. We also want to validate parent experiences and brainstorm solutions together. Anybody who's a parent, I think, my own experience, I guess I'm not going to say anybody who's a parent. I'm just going to talk about my experience as a parent. It still is the hardest thing that I have ever done. It brought out the most wonderful feelings in me, and it brought out the most primal and terrible feelings in me. And it brought out just some horrible thoughts that I never expected. For me personally, I understand where child abuse can come from because kids test us, right? And when we can validate those experiences that a parent has, and then brainstorm, what are we going to do about this? How can I support you? How do we get through it? How can I help you get through this? And sometimes that's talking about what works for you with the child. Providing referrals, sharing information about community resources, parenting classes, counseling services that can support families who are dealing with trauma, working with mental health professionals or social workers when we need to support families and children. And then having opportunities for family involvement in the childcare setting, whether that's family events, workshops, so that we can strengthen that home care connection. And being aware of and respecting the cultural backgrounds of families and incorporating those practices into our care with children or therapy with children or just our practice with kids. So what about when we are stressed or overwhelmed? One thing is to take deep breaths. Do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise where you, think or notice 5 things that you see, 4 things that you hear, 3 things that you feel, 2 things that you smell, 1 thing that maybe you taste, as a way to ground yourself. You might call somebody that you find supportive. Hopefully, many of you are already experiencing reflective supervision in whatever work that you do, or you have colleagues that you can call and you can talk to. Do something that you enjoy. Music, read a book, take a bath, go for a run, exercise, whatever it is for you, right? Think about your successes. Think about what you're thankful for. Reframe these challenges into opportunities. Kids are not misbehaving because they want to bother us. I know sometimes it seems like they are. They really know how to push our buttons. And when we can see it as their ability to cope has been stretched, or, this is a skill they still need to develop, they're only, less than 1 year old? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old? They don't have the skills. Think about how many people who lose their regulation in a difficult situation. And then think about the fact that these are really young kids. A big mistake we make nationwide is having these inappropriate expectations for what kids are able to do. And a really big one that we do is we have these inappropriate expectations of kids' emotional abilities, what they are able to do in terms of their own self-regulation. They can't self-regulate themselves if they don't have somebody more skilled supporting their self-regulation. So when we're losing it, if we can kind of remember that and think, you know, this child is depending on me to help them. I have this amazing opportunity to influence their life. Getting into nature can be helpful, work in the dirt. And of course, we make mistakes, right? We make mistakes all the time. And, you know, sadly, you know, pretty much every day. For me, many times a day. You guys may have many fewer times. And what we have to do is we have to forgive ourselves. So often what we do is we kick ourselves and we just notice over and over and over again what went wrong or why did I do that? Ah, I'm such an idiot. What we have to do is be our own best friend. If your best friend told you what they had done, would you be kicking them? No, you'd be there supporting them. And that's what we have to do for us. We have to do that. And if this is something that you struggle with learning to do, then I would really suggest that you might start focusing on it. Think about what you would do for your best friend and then do it for you. Practice it when things are going well so that when you do make a mistake, because you will, and be able to work on forgiving yourself. And remember, you're not in this alone. One of the greatest things that I love about early childhood is how we collaborate with each other. We work together, we play in the sandbox together, we support each other, and we can do so much to support kids. So now I'd like to get to our case study as we think about Alex's journey to thriving through his experience of trauma-informed care. This is a 2-year-old little guy in a family childcare center. He was removed from an unstable home environment due to severe neglect and some domestic violence. He entered foster care at 18 months, and he was placed with a foster family that sought trauma-informed care. You know, upon entering the child care center, he showed signs of significant trauma, you know, with heightened anxiety, of course, emotional regulation difficulties, lots of outbursts. He didn't really want to be in group activities. He had trouble forming attachments with his caregivers, aggressive behavior toward his peers. His language development was delayed. He had difficulty with fine and gross motors, likely due to a lack of that early stimulation, right? So this is what we know about Alex. I'd love to have you get into breakout groups and think about what you might do in terms of implementing trauma-informed care to support Alex's thriving.
Okay, so we are going to put you guys into breakout groups and have that discussion. So Heather, you are in one breakout group. Jeff, you're in another breakout group, and Stephanie. So Shayna will go ahead and open up those breakout groups. We will stay in there for about till
Maybe
about 20 after, and then Vonda will just kind of move you in and out of the breakout groups. Hey, Vonda. You want to wrap us all up, and then you're on mute though.
yes.
Okay.
So can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right. So like I have to say I was in a rock star group there, and you know, we talked about creating the safe, nurturing environment with routines, safe spaces, thinking about response so that we can provide physical comfort, emotional support, having that, one thing to think about would be a primary caregiver model to build a strong relationship with, modeling calm behavior, teaching coping skills to support emotional regulation, and then engaging the foster family with open communication, having referrals, all those things that you guys were talking about to support.
Oh, no. Did she freeze for everybody else? Okay, now you're back, Vonda. You froze there for a minute.
Oh, no, I'm so sorry. After 6 months, what they saw was better emotional regulation, better social interaction. So he started making friends, and watching him begin to meet those developmental milestones, having strengthened attachment relationships. And really the thing I think of is the transformative impact of trauma-informed care, that there's always hope. No matter what age a person is, 78, 80, 90, there is still hope for that person. And, we are all transforming. And I don't know if there are any questions that I might be able to support. Sorry, I was supposed to finish a few minutes ago, you guys. Just 4 questions. But I love the slide to think about how we go and develop throughout our lives. And we all become butterflies over time.
Well, that's a great way to end it. I will open it up to any questions that anybody has. We have about 3 minutes before I say we are at our time.
No questions,
Okay.
but I did just want to say thank you, Vonda. You have such a calming voice and demeanor. I could even feel it over this venue. So thank you for what you brought and bringing yourself.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I agree. Okay, well, if each of the groups will send in those recommendations to Shayna, that would be great. We'll compile those. And then Vonda, if you will just share me your PowerPoints, we will send those out to all the participants. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Our next session will be in September 18th. And we will see you then. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.